Hi boys and girls. In this video, we are going to talk about ought to. In this lesson, we are going to look at the use of ought to and ought not to. And we are going to learn how to make sentences with ought to and ought not to. First, what does it mean? And what do we use it for? Ought to means should. So the negative form would be ought not to, which means should not. We use it to give advice. So let's look at the example, line 8 to 9. They ought to care about the elderly. They ought to care about the elderly. So it means they should care about the elderly. So the two sentences with ought to and should have the same meaning. In terms of meaning, ought to is exactly the same as should. If you can use should in a sentence, then you can also use ought to. However, there are couples of differences. Ought to is more formal, while should is less formal or is for daily use. And ought to is more for written English, while should is more commonly used in spoken English. That's why we always use ought to in the news reports and proposals. Ought to is more old-fashioned, while should is more modern. So, for should, sometimes we will use the contracted form like this. We shouldn't waste energy. However, the negative form of ought to is generally not contracted. Like this. We ought not to waste energy. With ought to, we need to use the full form, and the sentence sounds more formal. With should, we can make questions like this. What time should I get there? With ought to, you can technically make questions, but it sounds a bit too formal. What time ought I to get there? It sounds unnatural. So it is suggested that you don't use ought to in this way. To sum up, if we want to sound more formal, or in written English, we will use ought to, while we use should in our daily English, or when we want to sound less formal. Now, let's look at how we use it in a sentence. First, boys and girls, please remember that we use ought to or ought not to with base form. Now, let's look at some examples. Look at these two pictures. We ought not to force our way onto the train. So you may see we use the base form force here. We ought to let passengers exit first. So again, we use the base form after ought to. Now, here comes another example. Look at these two pictures. We loudly to our friends. What should we use here? Yes, you're right. We ought not to talk loudly to our friends. Remember, we use ought not to with base form. Next, our voice down. So what should the answer be? Yes, we ought to keep our voice down. See, we use base form after ought to. Here comes another example. We block the door. So what should it be? Yes, we ought not to block the door. Next one. We ought fall our way into the train. What should the answer be? Yes, we ought to move our way into the train. So here comes the challenge. Look at the picture. How would you finish the sentence? The sea is polluted. We stop throwing things into it. So, yes, you're right. We ought to stop throwing things into it. Next one, look at the picture. Water is valuable. We waste it. We turn off the tap after use. Do you know the answers? Yes, you're right. We ought not to waste it. And we ought to turn off the tap after use. Next one. The rainforests are disappearing. We treasure them. We cut down so many trees. Do you know the answers? Yes, you're right. We ought to treasure them. We ought not to cut down so many trees. Noise from TVs causes noise pollution. We turn the volume down. So what should it be? Yes, you're right. We ought to turn the volume down. Next one. Plastic is not good for the environment. So, how would you finish the sentence? By using this clause? Yes, you're right. We ought not to use so many plastic products. So boys and girls, you did a very great job. Let's sum up a little bit. In this lesson, we have learned ought to means should, while ought not to means should not. And we use ought to and ought not to with the base form of the verb. And we have also tried to make sentences with ought to and ought not to. So here comes the end of the lesson. I want you to make a sentence with ought to or ought not to. Yes, you did a very great job. That's the end of our lesson. Thank you very much and happy Easter!